My name is Clara. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life I've been described with words that sound gentle, but feel limiting. Reliable, low maintenance, the calm one. I work in a role that supports others, a role that rarely draws attention. People often assume I'm agreeable because I don't interrupt. They assume I'm unaffected because I don't dramatize. They assume I'm unaware because I don't react quickly. I've learned that being underestimated is its own kind of invisibility. If you asked the people closest to me who I was, they would probably say I was easy to have around. The one who remembered birthdays. The one who didn't argue during the holidays. The one who listened more than she spoke. I became fluent in the language of being useful without being seen. And for a long time, I believed that was a virtue. Something earned. Something noble. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or winning an argument. It's about the slow realization that the version of myself I had been protecting wasn't actually mine to begin with. It's about the moment I understood how power can exist quietly, how truth doesn't always arrive with noise, and how dignity doesn't require an audience. The night everything changed didn't look dramatic from the outside. It was a family dinner. Plates passed. Casual conversation. The kind of evening you'd forget by the next morning. But that was the night I learned the truth about my birth at a family dinner. Not through a confession, not through an apology, but through something far smaller and far more devastating. One sentence shattered everything I thought I knew. What followed wasn't chaos. It was stillness. A long internal recalibration that took months, not minutes. I didn't confront anyone that night. I didn't cry in the bathroom or storm out. I went home, washed the dishes in silence, and slept like someone who didn't yet understand they had crossed into a different life. This story traces what happened after, how I re-examined every memory without rewriting them, how I chose restraint over reaction, how silence became intentional rather than imposed. You won't hear shouting here. You won't hear villains or heroes. Just people, systems, and the quiet consequences of truths spoken too late. I'm telling this now because I know there are others who've felt that subtle dislocation, the sense that something fundamental shifted, even though no one else noticed. If you've ever been seen as easy when you were actually enduring, or calm when you were carefully observing, you may recognize parts of yourself in this. So before we begin, I want to ask you gently, have you ever discovered that the story you were living inside wasn't the one you agreed to, and realized that noticing it was the first act of reclaiming yourself? For most of my life, I was defined less by who I was and more by how easy I made things for other people. In my family, I was the steady one. Not the oldest, not the youngest, not the one with the loud opinions or visible crises. I was the one who adjusted. If plans changed, I adapted. If tensions rose, I softened them. If someone forgot something important, I remembered it quietly and filled the gap without announcing it. No one ever told me to do this. That's what made it feel like a character instead of conditioning. At gatherings, I was often seated wherever there was space. Not because anyone was unkind, but because no one worried about my comfort. I'd be handed coats to hold, dishes to carry, and conversations to continue when someone else drifted away. Clara doesn't mind, people would say, smiling. And I would smile back, because technically, I didn't. At work, it was similar. I was trusted with details others overlooked. Systems, timelines, follow-ups. I became the person things passed through on their way to somewhere more visible. My name rarely appeared on the final slide, but the project would have collapsed without the structure underneath. When something succeeded, it was teamwork. When something stalled, I was asked if I could take another look. I told myself this meant I was valued, but value is not the same as visibility. And visibility is not the same as respect. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. That's important to say. There were no insults, no cruelty that could be easily pointed to. What existed instead was a soft assumption that I would always be available, always reasonable, always fine. My needs were invisible, not because they were ignored, but because they were never anticipated. When people described me, they used words like low drama, easygoing, and grounded. Compliments that came with an unspoken footnote. She won't complicate things. I learned early that being uncomplicated kept me included, so I became fluent in omission. I didn't mention when something hurt if it wasn't worth addressing. I didn't correct small inaccuracies about myself because it felt indulgent. I let people fill in the blanks about who I was, and I lived inside those assumptions because it was simpler than challenging them. In my family, especially, I occupied a very specific space. I was reliable, but not central. Involved, but not essential. Loved, I believe, but in a way that didn't require curiosity. No one asked me many questions about my inner life. They assumed, perhaps correctly, that if something mattered enough, I would bring it up, and I rarely did. Looking back, I can see how that role benefited everyone else. It kept the peace. Smooth transitions. Absorbed friction. I became the buffer without realizing buffers erode quietly over time. But at the time, I didn't think of myself as invisible. I thought of myself as mature. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being seen as strong. People stop checking in. They stop offering support. They assume your silence is stability, not self-containment. And when you don't contradict that assumption, it hardens into identity. That was who I was to them. The woman who didn't need much. The one who would understand. The one who wouldn't take things personally. I internalized that version of myself so deeply that I didn't realize how little room it left for surprise, or vulnerability, or truth. So when I think about who I was before everything changed, I don't see someone naive or weak. I see someone highly functional within a narrow definition. Someone who believed that being needed was the same as being known. And that belief shaped every interaction, every silence, every decision to let something pass. It set the stage for what came next. Not because I deserved it, but because no one, including me, had learned to see me clearly yet. The first moment I can clearly point to didn't announce itself as important. That's how these things usually begin. Not with impact, but with something slightly off. Something that doesn't hurt enough to justify stopping the room. It happened at a family gathering, months before the dinner that would later change everything. We were sitting around the table after a meal, plates half cleared, conversation thinning into smaller side comments. Someone asked a question about family history. Nothing formal, just one of those casual, nostalgic prompts people use to fill silence. My aunt laughed and said, "Well, of course, Clara wouldn't remember that part." She said it lightly, almost fondly. There was a pause. Not long enough to be awkward, but long enough for me to notice. I remember thinking, why wouldn't I remember? I had been there for every retelling, every version of the story. I had listened carefully, like I always did. But the assumption had already landed that there were things about our family narrative that simply didn't belong to me. I smiled. That was my reflex. The practiced response that smoothed over moments before they turned into questions. Someone else jumped in, the conversation moved on, and the moment disappeared for everyone except me. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, a misstatement, a throwaway comment. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, reading meaning into something that didn't deserve it. But something had shifted internally, not loudly, just enough to register. That night, I replayed the moment while doing dishes. Not with anger, but with curiosity. Why had that sentence stayed with me? Why had it felt excluding? I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even mention it to a friend. I stored it the way I stored most things that didn't have a clear place, quietly, carefully, without labeling it as harm. After that, I began to notice patterns that had always existed but had blended into the background before. Stories about when we were all together that skipped over years I was present for. Jokes about family traits that were never applied to me, even when they fit. Decisions were made about gatherings or plans that I was informed of, not consulted on. None of it was overt. That's what made it effective. Each instance was small enough to dismiss on its own, and everyone else did dismiss them. If I brought one up, it would sound petty, or paranoid, or self-centered. So I didn't. Instead, I began to observe more closely, not in a suspicious way, just attentively. I listened to how people spoke when they assumed I wasn't paying attention. I noted how often my presence was acknowledged as helpful rather than essential. There was a subtle difference between being appreciated and being integrated. What made that first small cut significant wasn't the comment itself. It was the realization that no one had noticed it land. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't think it could hurt me. The role I occupied didn't include fragility, and because I didn't correct it, the assumption held. I continued showing up as I always had. I cooked. I remembered. I followed up. I filled the silences. Outwardly, nothing changed. But internally, I had started to separate who I was from who I was perceived to be. A thin line at first, barely visible. Still, it was there. That moment didn't break trust. It didn't create distance. It did something quieter and more dangerous. It planted a question I couldn't unask. What else do they assume about me without checking if it's true? I didn't know then that this question would eventually lead me to something far larger. At the time, it simply sat with me, unresolved, like a hairline crack you don't notice until pressure builds. And because no one else saw it, I learned something important that night. Something that would shape everything that followed. If I wanted clarity, I would have to find it myself. After that first small cut, nothing in my life changed in ways that were immediately visible. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a new reality. It quietly reframes the old one. I kept telling myself that families are imperfect, that people misspeak, that closeness can create blind spots. I reminded myself of all the ways I was included. The invitations, the holidays, the casual check-ins. I stacked these examples like evidence in a case against my own discomfort. Discomfort, I decided, was not proof. So when similar moments happened again, I treated them as isolated incidents. A comment here, an assumption there. Each time, small enough to explain away. Each time, easy to rationalize. When relatives reminisced and said, "You wouldn't know this, Clara," I laughed softly and let it go. When decisions were made about family logistics without my input, I told myself they were just being efficient. When my preferences were overridden with "you're flexible," I agreed, because I had trained everyone, including myself, to believe that flexibility was my defining trait. What I didn't acknowledge then was how often flexibility is mistaken for consent. I began to notice that my silence made things easier for everyone else. It prevented conversations they didn't know how to have. It spared them from examining dynamics that had worked comfortably for years. And because I wasn't visibly unhappy, there was no reason for them to change. So I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, because I believed that speaking up required a certain threshold of harm, something undeniable, something dramatic. And this wasn't that. This was subtle, ambiguous, easy to misinterpret. I didn't want to be the person who made things uncomfortable over nothing. There's a particular internal logic that develops when you start normalizing small dismissals. You become very skilled at downplaying your own reactions. You learn to ask yourself, not "is this fair?" but "is this worth it?" Most of the time, I'd decided it wasn't. I also told myself that my role had benefits. I wasn't pulled into conflicts. I wasn't scrutinized. I moved through spaces with relative ease. People trusted me because I didn't challenge them. There was safety in that, or at least the appearance of it. But safety that depends on your silence is conditional. At work, this pattern deepened. I was praised for being adaptable, for rolling with changes, for not needing much direction. My workload grew accordingly. When I hinted at boundaries, they were acknowledged politely and then forgotten. When I followed up, I was thanked for my patience. I started to see how easily patience can be exploited when it's mistaken for infinite capacity. Still, I didn't frame any of this as disrespect at the time. That word felt too strong, too accusatory. I told myself that no one intended harm, and intention, I believed, mattered more than impact. That belief kept me quiet for a long time. What I didn't see yet was how my own rationalizations were participating in the pattern. By constantly interpreting others generously, I was interpreting myself minimally. My feelings required justification. Theirs were taken at face value. And because I was so good at understanding others, no one ever had to practice understanding me. The shift was gradual. I began to speak less in group settings, not out of withdrawal, but out of recalibration. I listened more carefully. I noticed who followed up with questions and who didn't. I paid attention to what information was shared freely and what was withheld by default. I told myself I was simply being observant. But underneath that was a growing awareness that something about my position in these relationships was asymmetrical. I was investing more emotional labor than I was receiving. I was offering context, patience, and presence, while others offered assumptions. And because this imbalance had never been acknowledged, it felt normal. To them, and eventually to me. Normalization is powerful because it dulls your sense of contrast. You stop noticing what's missing because you've never been encouraged to expect it. You adapt your expectations downward and call it maturity. By the time I realized I was doing this, the habit was deeply ingrained. I had become someone who could absorb almost anything quietly. Someone who could make herself small without resentment. Someone who could endure without complaint. And at the time, I still believed that was a strength. I didn't yet understand that endurance without recognition doesn't make you strong. It makes you convenient. There's a moment when you stop asking why things feel uneven and start noticing how they're organized. For me, that moment didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. I began to see that I wasn't just reacting to situations. I was performing a role that had been quietly assigned to me over the years. Not through a conversation, not through intention, but through repetition and reward. I was the reliable one. The one who would show up early and stay late. The one who would take notes instead of taking up space. The one who would sense tension before it surfaced and dissolve it before anyone else had to deal with it. In my family, this role was so ingrained that it went unquestioned. I was expected to help coordinate, to remember, to smooth. When something went wrong, I was asked to assist. When something went right, I was thanked briefly and then forgotten in the glow of whoever stood at the center. No one asked me if I wanted this role, but they didn't have to. I had accepted it so consistently that it appeared voluntary. What struck me wasn't that others relied on me. It was that they relied on me without curiosity. They didn't wonder how I felt about being the constant. They didn't check whether I needed support. They assumed that my competence included emotional self-sufficiency. Competence, I learned, is often treated as consent. Once I saw the role clearly, I began to notice how it shaped expectations. If I was quiet, it was taken as agreement. If I were flexible, it was treated as availability. If I was calm, it was interpreted as unaffected. And if I ever deviated from that script, if I hesitated or declined or asked for clarification, it created subtle confusion. People would tilt their heads, laugh lightly, or say things like, "That's not like you." That phrase stayed with me. "That's not like you." It wasn't an observation. It was a correction. It reminded me that the version of me they were comfortable with was narrow, useful, predictable, and any movement outside of it felt like a disruption. At work, the pattern mirrored itself almost exactly. I was the person who held things together. When there was uncertainty, tasks were routed through me. When leadership changed direction, I was expected to absorb the shift without complaint. My adaptability became infrastructure, and infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. I realized then that my role wasn't just invisible, it was foundational. And foundations are rarely thanked. They're assumed. This understanding didn't make me angry. It made me careful. I stopped volunteering information unnecessarily. I answered questions precisely, without cushioning them. I noticed how often others spoke in generalities while I spoke in specifics. How often I was asked to clarify things that were already clear. I wasn't withdrawing. I was observing how the role functioned. What unsettled me most was recognizing how long I had participated in my own narrowing. I had believed that being helpful was the same as being valued, that being easy was the same as being loved, that being needed was proof of belonging. But roles built on usefulness alone are fragile. The moment you stop performing, the relationship is tested. I hadn't stopped performing yet, but I had begun to imagine what would happen if I did. And that was when I understood something crucial. The role I was assigned wasn't neutral. It protected others from discomfort while requiring constant self-regulation from me. It kept systems running smoothly while obscuring the cost. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. I didn't confront anyone about this realization. There was nothing to accuse, no clear wrongdoing to point to. The role existed because it worked, for everyone else. But for the first time, I questioned whether it worked for me. That question didn't demand immediate action. It simply waited, and it waited patiently as the ground beneath my understanding began to shift. The day something shifted didn't arrive with conflict. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment anyone else would remember. That's what makes it so difficult to explain. It was an ordinary weekday evening. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop something off. Documents I had helped organize because that was still my role. The house smelled the same as it always had. Familiar, comforting, unchanged. My mother was in the kitchen, sorting mail. The television murmured in the background. We talked about practical things. Appointments, schedules, small logistics. I listened, nodded, and responded where needed. Everything followed the usual rhythm. At some point, she mentioned an upcoming family dinner. The same casual tone. The same assumption that I would attend, help, and facilitate. And then she said, almost absent-mindedly, "We'll talk about that when everyone's there. You don't really need to be involved in that part." She didn't look at me when she said it. There was nothing sharp in her voice, no secrecy, no warning. Just a sentence offered as a logistical clarification. And something inside me went very still. I didn't ask what that referred to. I didn't push for details. I smiled faintly and said, okay. But internally, a quiet recalibration began. I realized that there were conversations happening around me, not with me. Decisions being deferred to group settings, I was expected to attend physically, but not participate meaningfully. I was present, but peripheral. And I had accepted that without question for years. Standing there, I noticed how instinctively I had minimized myself in that moment. How easily I had stepped aside without knowing why. How quickly I had reassured her and myself that it was fine. That's when it shifted, not into anger, into awareness. I saw, with uncomfortable clarity, that my inclusion had always been conditional. I was included when I was useful. When my presence smoothed things over. When I asked for nothing complicated in return. But when something mattered, when conversations required ownership, truth, or consequence, I was gently removed from the center. And no one thought that required explanation. I went home that night and sat in silence longer than usual. I didn't distract myself. I didn't reframe. I didn't rush to forgiveness or understanding. I let the discomfort exist without resolving it. That was new. I began to think back through other moments. Times I had been told information late, or not at all. Times decisions were announced to me as conclusions rather than discussions. Times my reaction was anticipated more than my opinion. It wasn't that I had been excluded entirely. It was that my involvement had been carefully curated, and I had mistaken that for trust. That night, I wrote in my notebook for the first time in months. Not emotionally, methodically. I wrote down moments I remembered, without commentary. Dates, phrases, context. Not to build a case, to build clarity. I slept poorly, but not anxiously. There was no racing heart, no spiraling. Just a steady sense that something fundamental had been acknowledged. The next morning, I moved through my routine differently. I noticed how often I anticipated others' needs before my own. How reflexively I stepped in to solve things no one had asked me to solve. How rarely I asked myself whether I wanted to be involved at all. This wasn't a confrontation with anyone else. It was a confrontation with my own habits. I didn't announce a change. I didn't declare boundaries. I simply paused. And in that pause, I felt something unfamiliar but unmistakable. Choice. For the first time, silence didn't feel imposed. It felt deliberate. I didn't yet know where this shift would lead. I didn't know what truths were circling closer. I only knew that I would no longer participate automatically. Something had moved from unconscious to conscious, from pattern to decision. And once that happens, there is no returning to how things were. After that evening, nothing about my life changed outwardly. I still showed up. I still responded to messages. I still fulfilled obligations. To anyone watching, I was the same Clara I had always been. But internally, silence had shifted from habit to strategy. Before, I stayed quiet because it felt easier, kinder, more mature. Now I stayed quiet because I was observing what happened in the absence of my usual anticipatory behavior. I stopped filling gaps. When someone paused in conversation, I let the pause linger. When a plan was vague, I waited to see who would clarify it. When responsibilities were implied but not assigned, I didn't automatically assume them. The result was subtle and revealing. People grew slightly uneasy. Not alarmed. Just off balance. Conversations stumbled. Decisions took longer. Small inefficiencies appeared where my smoothing had once been invisible. No one accused me of changing. Instead, they began to offer explanations. I thought you'd handle that. I assumed you didn't mind. You're usually so good at these things. The language was telling. My absence was framed as a deviation, not as an absence of agreement. I responded calmly. I didn't realize that was mine to handle. Or, I didn't see that request. Always factual, never defensive. What surprised me was how quickly others filled the space when I didn't. Tasks were reassigned. Someone else stepped in. Things still got done. It became clear that my constant involvement hadn't been necessary. It had been convenient. This realization brought neither satisfaction nor resentment, just clarity. In my family, the shift was even quieter. I listened more than ever, but I volunteered less. I asked neutral questions instead of offering solutions. I allowed others to explain themselves fully instead of interpreting their intentions for them. Silence, used this way, changed the tone of interactions. People spoke more carefully. Some spoke more vaguely. A few seemed unsettled by the lack of reassurance they were used to receiving from me. No one confronted me about it. There was nothing concrete to confront, and that was the point. I wasn't withdrawing out of spite. I was choosing not to overfunction, not to translate, not to absorb. The most unexpected part was how often my silence was mistaken for weakness. When I didn't respond immediately, people assumed I hadn't noticed. When I didn't push back, they assumed agreement. When I remained calm, they assumed compliance. They didn't realize that silence can be a form of boundary when it's no longer automatic. I took notes during this period. Not obsessively, but consistently. I wrote down what happened when I didn't intervene. Who stepped up? Who avoided responsibility? Who grew frustrated? Who adjusted? Patterns emerged. I saw which relationships relied on my emotional labor and which didn't. Which people respected clarity and which relied on ambiguity. Which dynamics could survive without my constant regulation. This wasn't preparation for confrontation. It was an assessment. At work, I did the same. I stopped reminding people of deadlines that weren't mine. I answered questions with exactly the information asked for. No more, no less. I let meetings end without summarizing what others had already agreed to. My performance reviews didn't suffer. In fact, they improved. My contributions became more visible because they were no longer diluted by unpaid labor. That surprised me. It also taught me something important. Silence only looks like weakness to people who benefit from you speaking for free. There were moments when staying quiet felt uncomfortable, when I could have smoothed something over and chose not to. When I watched confusion unfold and resisted the urge to rescue it, I sat with that discomfort. I learned the difference between compassion and self-erasure. By choosing when to speak, I reclaimed authorship over my presence. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. And in that decision-making space, I began to notice inconsistencies. Gaps. Stories that didn't quite align. Things that had been glossed over in the past because I hadn't asked the right questions. or any questions at all. Silence gave me room to hear what was actually being said and what wasn't. What they never noticed was how much I had always paid attention. Because I spoke so little about myself, people assumed I wasn't tracking details, that I was present but not precise, that my calmness came from disengagement rather than discipline. They were wrong. I had always been observant. It was how I survived being underestimated. I remembered dates, inconsistencies, and tone shifts. I noticed that stories changed slightly depending on who was in the room. I noticed which topics were avoided and which were over-explained. Before, I hadn't done anything with those observations. I treated them as background noise, interesting, but irrelevant. Now I started organizing them, not in a dramatic way. Quietly. Methodically. I returned to my old notebooks. Calendars, emails, messages, family group chats that stretched back years. I didn't reread them emotionally. I read them structurally, looking for sequences, timing, omissions. I wasn't searching for betrayal. I was mapping patterns. I noticed how certain conversations always happened without me and were then summarized later. How certain decisions were framed as spontaneous when they clearly required planning. How information reached me only after it had been processed by others first. At first, I told myself this was normal family behavior. Not everyone is involved in everything. But then I noticed something else. The exclusions weren't random. They followed a logic. Whenever a topic involved history, ownership, or long-term consequences, I was peripheral. When it involved logistics, support, or emotional cushioning, I was central. That distinction mattered. I began to write timelines, not conclusions, just facts. When things were said, by whom, in what context. I noted when explanations were vague and when they were unusually specific. I also paid attention to reactions. Who became defensive when I asked neutral questions? Who changed the subject? Who filled the silence quickly? Who avoided eye contact? This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. At work, this skill had always served me well. I could see bottlenecks before they formed. I could anticipate conflicts before they surfaced. I realized I had never applied that same analytical lens to my own life, because I had assumed my role was to adapt, not to analyze. What surprised me most was how little effort this required. I wasn't digging, I wasn't spying. I was simply no longer filtering information through the need to keep things comfortable. When you stop protecting other people from their own inconsistencies, clarity arrives quickly. I also noticed how often people assumed I didn't remember things. They would say, "You probably don't recall," or "This was before your time," even when it wasn't. I stopped correcting them. Letting people underestimate your memory can be useful. As weeks passed, the picture became clearer. There were gaps in the official family narrative, years that were referenced vaguely, events that were glossed over, decisions that were described as inevitable rather than chosen. And at the center of many of those gaps was me, or rather, my absence. I began to suspect that my peripheral position wasn't accidental. It wasn't malicious either. It was convenient. Easier to manage one less voice. Easier to maintain a clean story when not everyone is invited to examine it. That realization didn't make me feel angry. It made me feel separate, as if I had been living adjacent to my own history. I didn't confront anyone with my findings. There was still nothing concrete enough to justify that. And more importantly, I wasn't ready to reveal how much I knew. Knowledge changes dynamics. I wanted to understand those dynamics fully before altering them. So I kept listening, kept documenting, kept letting people assume I was unaware. What they never noticed was that my silence had shifted again. It was no longer just strategic. It was preparatory. I wasn't collecting information to use against anyone. I was preparing myself for whatever truth might surface. Because by then, I could feel it approaching. There was a sense of convergence, of details aligning, of questions narrowing. I didn't yet know what I would discover. I only knew that when it arrived, I would be ready to receive it without panic, without collapse, without needing anyone else to explain it to me. They had mistaken my quiet for passivity. In reality, I had been positioning myself. The truth didn't arrive with confirmation from another person. It arrived when two separate timelines finally overlapped. I was sitting at my desk late one evening, papers spread out in front of me. Not dramatically, not obsessively. Just documents I had gradually gathered over weeks. Old records, copies of forms, a few scanned files I had requested for unrelated reasons, and then set aside. I wasn't looking for anything specific that night. I was reviewing, verifying, doing what I always did when something felt incomplete. And then I noticed a date. It didn't match. At first, I assumed it was an administrative error. Those happen all the time. I cross-checked it against another document. Same discrepancy, different source. I felt a pause inside myself, not fear, not excitement, just attention sharpening. I pulled out my notebook and flipped back through the timeline I had been quietly maintaining. Notes about family moves. A hospital name is mentioned once and never again. A story that was always told vaguely, as if the details were unimportant. But details are never unimportant. They're just inconvenient. I didn't jump to conclusions. I've never been someone who does. I verified. I requested one more record, then another. All legitimate, all procedural. Nothing that raised suspicion. When the final piece arrived, it didn't shock me. It clarified me. The story I had been told about my birth, the timing, the circumstances, the certainty with which it had always been recounted, was incomplete. Not entirely false, but edited. I learned that I was born under circumstances that had been deliberately simplified. Those key decisions had been made quickly, quietly, and with the intention of closing a chapter before questions could form. I learned that some people knew the full context, and some people, myself included, were never meant to. There was no single sentence written anywhere that explained everything. Truth rarely works that way. It existed across documents, absences, and careful phrasing. What mattered wasn't just what I learned. It was the one who had chosen not to tell me. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel betrayed in the way people expect betrayal to feel. What I felt was distance, like stepping back from a painting and realizing the proportions were different from what you'd believed. Nothing about my childhood memories changed. The love I had received still existed. The care was still real. But the framing was different. I understood suddenly why certain conversations had always felt off limits. Why were questions about my early years redirected? Why was my presence managed rather than fully integrated? This wasn't about cruelty. It was about control. Control of narrative. Control of timing. Control of who got to ask which questions. And once I saw that, I understood why my silence had been so useful to others. I didn't confront anyone with this information. Not then. Not even later. Not directly. Because confrontation would have centered their explanations. And this wasn't about explanations anymore. It was about agency. I closed the folder, placed it back in my drawer, and went to bed. I slept deeply. The next morning I woke up with an unfamiliar sense of steadiness. Not relief, not anger, alignment. For the first time, I understood why I had always felt slightly adjacent to my own family story. Why belonging had felt conditional without my being able to name the condition. I had been living inside a version of events that required my ignorance to remain intact. And now it wasn't. There was no celebration in this reveal. No rush to act. No impulse to expose. Only clarity. Clarity about what I was owed. Clarity about what I would no longer accept. Clarity about the fact that once you know the truth about your own origin, you cannot unknow it. And you cannot be managed in the same way again. I didn't tell anyone what I had learned. I didn't need to. From that moment on, the leverage existed whether I used it or not. And the most powerful thing about leverage is knowing you have it, and choosing when, or if, to move. Knowing the truth didn't force me to act. That was the first choice. There's a common belief that once you uncover something foundational, you must respond immediately. Confront, confess, expose, demand. But clarity doesn't always call for motion. Sometimes it calls for restraint. I spent weeks doing nothing outwardly different. I attended the family dinner that had been mentioned before. I listened. I passed dishes. I smiled at the right moments. And all the while, I noticed how carefully certain topics were avoided. How glances were exchanged when conversations drifted too close to edges that now had names in my mind. No one knew that I knew, and that changed everything. I realized that I was standing at a crossroads that only existed because of my silence. If I spoke now, the story would become about justification, about why they did what they did, about context, about intentions. The focus would shift away from my experience and toward their defense. If I stayed silent forever, nothing would change. The old role would reassert itself, and the truth would become another thing I carried quietly for the sake of harmony. There was a third option. I could act without announcing why. That option required patience, precision, a willingness to let consequences unfold without narrating them. I considered what I actually wanted, not emotionally, but structurally. I didn't want apologies shaped by fear of exposure. I didn't want dramatic reckonings that resolved nothing. I didn't want to punish anyone. What I wanted was authorship. I wanted to live as someone who no longer needed permission to ask questions, set boundaries, or define her place. Someone whose involvement was chosen, not assumed. So I began to plan, not revenge, not escape, but reconfiguration. I reviewed my finances, updated beneficiaries, adjusted legal documents that had been set up years earlier with assumptions I no longer shared. I consulted professionals, not dramatically, not secretly, just responsibly. None of this was illegal. None of it was aggressive. It was simply me reclaiming decision-making that should have been mine all along. I also began to shift relational dynamics subtly. I declined certain responsibilities without explanation. I stopped mediating conflicts that didn't involve me. I answered personal questions with polite vagueness. When people pushed gently for more access, I didn't resist. I redirected. It was remarkable how quickly the system adapted once I stopped reinforcing it. There were moments of doubt. Late nights when I wondered if I was overreacting. If knowing the truth obligated me to share it. If silence made me complicit. I returned, again and again, to one grounding principle. I was not responsible for managing other people's comfort with my reality. That principle clarified everything. The irreversible choice wasn't about revealing the truth. It was about no longer living in a way that depended on my not knowing it. Once I made that decision, the rest followed naturally. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't prepare for confrontations. I prepared infrastructure, emotional, legal, and practical. Because infrastructure lasts longer than arguments. I accepted that some relationships would shift without explanation. That some people would feel distance without understanding why. That I might be misunderstood. I was willing to be misunderstood if it meant I was no longer misaligned. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like a cliff. It felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of adjusting to uneven footing. From that point on, everything I did was guided by a quiet, internal rule. I will not act to preserve a version of myself that requires my silence to survive. That rule didn't demand speed. It demanded consistency. And once it was set, there was no going back. Once the decision was made, the movement that followed was almost invisible. That was intentional. I didn't announce changes. I didn't explain shifts. I didn't hint at what I knew or what I was doing. I simply began to live as if my inner alignment mattered more than external reassurance. The first adjustments were practical. I separated responsibilities that had long been blurred. Family finances I had helped manage were quietly returned to their owners. Shared documents were organized and then stepped away from. I made it clear, calmly once, that certain tasks would no longer be mine. No justification, no apology. People accepted this more easily than I expected. When you stop offering extra labor, most systems reassign it without question. What lingers isn't resistance, it's surprise. At work, I did something similar. I clarified my scope. I documented processes I had been carrying in my head and then let others own them. Meetings shortened. Expectations sharpened. My value didn't decrease. It became legible. Legibility, I learned, is a form of protection. Privately, I made adjustments that no one else could see. I updated records to reflect what I now knew to be true. I ensured that my own history, medical, legal, personal, was documented accurately, not according to a simplified story that had once served someone else's comfort. I didn't need permission to do that. I never had. There was something grounding about taking care of these details. It reminded me that autonomy isn't loud. It's procedural. It's the quiet act of making sure your life reflects reality, even if no one else ever sees the paperwork. As these changes accumulated, subtle consequences began to surface. People started asking more questions, not about what I was doing, but about why I wasn't doing what I used to. The tone was casual, curious, occasionally confused. "You've been really busy lately. You don't seem as available. You're so quiet these days." I responded with honesty that revealed nothing. "I've been focusing on what's necessary." Or, "I'm just being more intentional." These were true statements. They were also complete. What struck me was how rarely anyone pressed further. Most people don't actually want explanations. They want reassurance that the old dynamic still exists. When you don't offer that reassurance, they adjust their expectations instead. In my family, the atmosphere shifted slowly. There were longer pauses in conversation, more direct requests instead of assumptions, less casual delegation. No one confronted me. There was nothing concrete to confront. From the outside, it probably looked like I had simply grown more independent. From the inside, I felt anchored. Moving in silence allowed me to avoid the emotional turbulence that often comes with change. There was no debate to win, no narrative to defend. I wasn't reacting. I was reorienting. And because I wasn't seeking validation, I didn't feel destabilized when it wasn't offered. The most powerful aspect of this phase was how little energy it required. Once I stopped managing everyone else's expectations, I had more capacity for my own life. I slept better. I made plans without factoring in others' assumptions. I felt present in my own decisions. I also became less predictable. That wasn't a tactic, it was a result. When people can't rely on you to fill the same role automatically, they start to see you as an independent actor. Not an extension of the system, but a participant who chooses. And choice changes how people relate to you. Still, I didn't rush ahead. I let time do its work. I allowed the distance to settle naturally. I resisted the urge to clarify things prematurely, because I knew that clarity, when it arrived, would land more honestly if it wasn't forced. I was no longer preparing for a reveal. I was living in alignment. And alignment has consequences, even when no one can name them yet. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived as absences. It started with small things. A delay in a response that would have once come quickly. A task left undone because no one had explicitly taken it on. A moment of confusion in a conversation where I would normally have translated or smoothed things over. At first, people assumed these were temporary lapses. Everyone has busy periods. Everyone shifts focus now and then. But as weeks passed, the pattern held. Without my quiet coordination, certain rhythms faltered. Family plans became more fragmented. Decisions took longer. Minor tensions surfaced and lingered instead of being quietly absorbed. What struck me was not the frustration. There was very little of that, but the confusion. People couldn't quite articulate what felt different. They sensed a loss, but they couldn't name it. Because the thing they were missing had never been acknowledged as labor in the first place. It's difficult to grieve something you never recognized as support. I noticed relatives reaching out to each other more directly, rather than through me. Not out of closeness, but necessity. I watched them negotiate dynamics I had once managed quietly. Some adapted, some struggled. No one blamed me. That would have required recognizing what I had been doing before. Instead, I heard comments like, "Things just feel more complicated lately," or, "Everyone seems a bit scattered." I listened. I nodded. I said nothing. At work, the effects were more measurable. Projects slowed slightly at first, then recalibrated. Processes that had depended on my memory were documented. Ownership was redistributed. There was a brief period of inefficiency, and then improvement. What had once relied on my constant presence became sustainable without it. That realization was both validating and unsettling. Validating, because it confirmed that I had been carrying more than my share. Unsettling, because it meant my overfunctioning had been masking structural weaknesses that others now had to face. In my family, those weaknesses took a different form. Old habits of avoidance became visible. Unspoken disagreements surfaced. People who had relied on me as a buffer now had to interact directly with one another. I watched this from a distance, not detached but not involved. There were moments when someone reached out to me, almost instinctively, as if expecting me to step back into the familiar role. A message phrased vaguely, a request without clear boundaries. I responded kindly, but I didn't step in. And slowly those attempts stopped. The most telling consequence wasn't conflict. It was recalibration. People adjusted their expectations of me downward in some areas, and upward in others. I was no longer assumed to be available, but I was taken more seriously when I did speak. My words carried more weight because they were no longer constant. I hadn't demanded respect. I had made space for it. There was also a quiet shift in how I was spoken about when I wasn't in the room. I didn't hear everything, of course, but I sensed it in tone changes, in the way people referenced me more cautiously, not fearfully, just thoughtfully, as if they weren't quite sure where I stood anymore. That uncertainty was uncomfortable for some. People prefer predictability, especially when it benefits them, but uncertainty is also where recalibration happens. I didn't take satisfaction in any of this. I didn't feel triumphant. If anything, I felt sober. Change, even necessary change, carries weight. There were moments when I missed the ease of the old role, the sense of being needed, the immediate utility. But I also recognized how much of that need had been manufactured by imbalance. I was no longer willing to maintain systems that depended on my self-erasure. The consequences continued to unfold quietly. Not as punishment, not as drama, as an adjustment. And once adjustment begins, it rarely stops until the system reflects reality more honestly. By the time anyone realized something fundamental had changed, the window to undo it had already closed. That's the nature of quiet shifts. They don't trigger alarm bells until they've settled into structure. The first signs of urgency appeared subtly. Questions became more pointed. Invitations were phrased more carefully. I noticed people checking in with me in ways they hadn't before, not out of concern, but out of recalibration. Are you okay? You've seemed different lately. I hope I didn't do something to upset you. These weren't apologies, they were probes. People sensed distance and assumed it was emotional. They looked for reassurance that things could go back to how they were, if only they said the right thing. But this wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about the foundation. What they didn't understand was that there was no single conversation that could resolve this. No clarification that would restore the old dynamic. The change hadn't come from misunderstanding. It had come from understanding too clearly. I could feel the shift in family gatherings. Conversations became more performative. People offered explanations that hadn't been requested. Old stories were retold with added detail, as if accuracy could be retroactively improved through emphasis. I listened politely. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative began to adjust once my silence no longer supported it. Details became more flexible. Certainty softened. Statements turned into suggestions. It was too late. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because the structure had already changed. I was no longer participating in a story that required my ignorance to function. There was a moment, small, easily missed, when I realized they knew something was irretrievable. It happened when someone said, "We probably should have talked about things more openly back then." Back then, a vague time, a closed chapter, a safe distance from accountability. I nodded. I didn't disagree, but I didn't offer absolution either. Because acknowledgement without ownership doesn't rebuild trust. It just names its absence. I could sense a quiet panic beneath the surface. Not dramatic, not desperate, but unsettled. The realization that something had shifted beyond negotiation. That whatever role I had once played was no longer available for reactivation. People tried, gently, to pull me back in, to involve me more, to offer transparency in small doses. But transparency offered after the fact doesn't feel like inclusion. It feels like damage control. I didn't reject these gestures. I accepted them neutrally, without enthusiasm, without resistance. The door wasn't slammed. It just wasn't open the way it used to be. I think that's what made it hardest for them. If I had been angry, they could have responded. If I had demanded explanations, they could have defended themselves. But I did neither. I had already done the work privately. I had already integrated the truth into my sense of self. There was nothing left to negotiate. By the time they were ready to fix things, I no longer needed fixing. That doesn't mean I stopped caring. It means I stopped contorting myself to preserve comfort that came at the cost of my clarity. Some relationships adjusted. They became more honest, more limited, more real. Others faded, not out of conflict, but out of incompatibility with the person I had become. And that was okay, because what I had lost wasn't connection. It was an illusion, and once illusion falls away, there is no repair that restores it. Only the possibility of something truer taking its place. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointing in its simplicity. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic unveiling of facts. Just a conversation that could no longer be avoided. It took place on an ordinary afternoon. I had been asked, carefully, if we could talk. The tone was gentle, almost cautious, as if they weren't sure which version of me they were addressing anymore. We sat across from each other at the same table where so many other conversations had happened. The setting was familiar, but the dynamic was not. They began by saying they felt distance, that I seemed different, that they missed how close we used to be. I listened without interrupting. Then came the careful questions. Had something happened? Was I upset about something specific? Had they done something wrong? I took a moment before answering, not for effect, just to choose precision over emotion. I said calmly, I've learned some things about my own history that changed how I understand myself. Because of that, I've needed to adjust how I show up. There it was. True. Complete, unprovocative. They asked what I meant. I didn't explain. Not because I was hiding, but because an explanation would have shifted the focus away from what mattered. This wasn't about persuading them. It was about naming a boundary. I'm not angry, I added, and I'm not asking for anything. I just don't want to participate in dynamics that don't include me fully. There was a pause. I could see the impulse to ask for details, to clarify, to correct, to justify. It hovered in the air, but they didn't push. Instead, one of them said quietly, We did the best we could. I nodded. I believe that, and I meant it. Believing that didn't require me to minimize the impact. It didn't require me to restore the old balance. It simply acknowledged that intention and outcome are not the same thing. That was the moment I saw it clearly. They weren't prepared for confrontation without heat. Without blame, there was nothing to defend against. Without anger, there was no script to follow. Silence settled, not tense but unfamiliar. Finally, I said, I'm not trying to change the past. I'm just choosing how much access it has to my present. That ended the conversation, not because it resolved everything, but because there was nothing left to argue. There were no promises made, no confessions demanded, no absolution granted, just an understanding, uncomfortable, incomplete, but real, that the relationship had shifted permanently. As I left, I didn't feel victorious or relieved. I felt steady. I had said exactly what was necessary and nothing more. Confrontation, I learned, doesn't require force. It requires clarity. And clarity, delivered calmly, leaves very little room for denial. I am not a different person now. That's the simplest and most important truth. I didn't become harder, colder, or more distant. I didn't replace compassion with detachment or understanding with judgment. What changed wasn't my nature. It was my position within my own life. I no longer confuse adaptability with obligation. Where I once moved instinctively toward what was needed, I now pause long enough to ask whether it's mine to provide. That pause has become a quiet form of self-respect. It doesn't require explanation. It doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. My relationships are fewer, but they are clearer. The people who remain in my life now engage with me more directly. They ask instead of assuming. They listen instead of leaning. When I speak, they hear it, not because my voice got louder, but because it's no longer constant. I still care deeply. I still show up. But I do so by choice, not reflex. There's a difference between being kind and being convenient. I've learned to recognize it in myself and in others. I've also made peace with the fact that some people will always prefer the version of me that asked for nothing. That version made their lives easier. Letting her go was not a loss of love. It was a loss of access. And access is not the same thing as connection. I often thought about how long I believed belonging meant being undemanding, how I mistook self-erasure for maturity. I don't judge myself for that. It was a survival strategy that worked until it didn't. Now, my sense of self is anchored in something steadier than approval. I know where my history begins and how it has shaped me. I don't need to perform gratitude for a narrative that excluded me. That knowledge doesn't make me bitter. It makes me whole. I move through my days with more intention. I protect my time. I allow silence without rushing to fill it. I let others take responsibility for their own discomfort. There's a quiet confidence that comes from not needing to be understood by everyone. From knowing that your life no longer depends on maintaining a version of yourself that fits neatly into someone else's story. I still attend family gatherings. I still laugh at familiar jokes. But I no longer play the role of buffer or translator. I'm present as myself, not as a function. And if that creates moments of awkwardness, I let them stand. Awkwardness is often just honesty adjusting. What I've gained isn't distance. It's alignment. My inner life matches my outward one more closely now. I don't say yes when I mean maybe. I don't say fine when I mean no. I don't offer explanations where boundaries suffice. This isn't empowerment in the loud, performative sense. It's not about proving anything. It's about living without the quiet tension that comes from knowing you're withholding parts of yourself to keep things smooth. I am still calm, still observant, still steady, but now those qualities serve me first. If there is a moral to this story, it isn't about exposure or confrontation. It's about authorship. For a long time, I believed that being patient, adaptable, and undemanding was the highest form of maturity. I thought strength meant absorbing discomfort quietly so others could remain comfortable. I thought love was proven by how little space you took up. I was wrong. What I've learned is that silence has different meanings depending on who chooses it. When silence is imposed, it diminishes you. When it's chosen, it defines you. Learning the truth about my birth at a family dinner didn't destroy my life. It didn't erase my past or negate the care I received. What it did was remove the final reason I had for doubting my own sense of misalignment. That feeling, that something didn't quite add up, was never ingratitude or oversensitivity. It was information. And once I trusted it, everything else made sense. The quiet power in this story doesn't come from what I revealed. It comes from what I no longer volunteer for. From stepping out of a role that required me to be smaller than I was. From choosing clarity over comfort, even when comfort would have been easier. There was no dramatic justice here. No moment where everyone apologized and everything healed neatly. Real justice, I've found, is quieter than that. It's living a life that no longer requires you to deny parts of yourself to maintain belonging. It's letting relationships adjust, or dissolve, based on truth rather than habit. It's allowing others to sit with the consequences of the dynamics they benefited from, without needing to punish them for it. I don't share this story to tell you what to do. I share it because many people live in quiet imbalance, carrying roles they never consciously chose. They are praised for being easy, strong, dependable, without being asked whether those labels cost them something. If you are one of those people, I hope this story offers something simple but profound. You don't have to become louder to become visible. You don't have to explain everything to justify your boundaries. And you don't owe anyone access to a version of yourself that survives on silence. Sometimes, the most decisive thing you can do is stop participating in a story that was written without your consent. So I'll leave you with this question, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Have you ever realized that the quietest change you made in your life was also the one that finally made it feel like your own?